Okay, I'd like to call the Committee of the Whole meeting for Monday, December 18th, 2023 to order. Roll call, please.
Mayor Gaffino.
Here.
Trustee Christensen.
Here.
Trustee Curtis.
Here.
Trustee Gately.
Here.
Trustee Lowry.
Here.
Trustee Nedved.
Here.
Trustee Salazar.
Here.
All right, thank you. Audience comments? Trustee comments? Item 1, Steve.
Thank you, Mayor. Item number 1 today is an update to our liquor code, and this is relevant to the Class Q license that was recently approved. So we created a new Class Q license back in November, and that was for banquet halls. We had never had one before. We had someone interested in opening an event space, so a Class Q license was opened. At that time, there was no consideration of whether or not they needed a supplemental entertainment license. So this conversation is relative to amending the supplemental entertainment license section of our code to allow live entertainment at banquet halls, essentially. So in this case, as a reminder, our supplemental entertainment, there's 2 categories. There's A and B. A is for simple solo artists, duets, people playing with an acoustic guitar, basically playing music out of a radio, that type of thing. And then the B is the more intensive. We're having a full live band, we're having a DJ, it's going to be amplified pretty loudly, and so that's what this would allow. So that supplemental entertainment license is available to restaurants right now. This would allow it to be available to banquet halls.
Yeah, I think it's okay. Makes sense.
Yeah. And for the record, and to make it clear, this is not relative specifically to that one event space. This would be for any banquet hall in the future.
I think that's fine.
All right.
That seems
Like Red
reasonable.
Oak?
All right.
Yep.
Sounds good. All right. Item 2, Steve.
Item number 2 on the agenda tonight, there's actually 2 items into one for discussion tonight, and it is relative to the new banquet space that's going to be occupying 1167 Oak Street, which is Sage Event Space. They have a class, they'll be looking for a Class Q license. So the first thing we're talking about is the banquet hall is requesting a Class Q license. Per our code, we bring it to the Committee of the Whole first, so that the village board can review any liquor license requests that are coming up. As a reminder, Class Q is one where they can ask for the host to supply the liquor or have a caterer with a state license provide the actual liquor at the event. They can also have they can have the host hire bartenders that are properly certified and they meet our section of our code, providing us the dram shop insurance and liquor liability insurance and everything. So that's what the Q sets up. It allows them to do it through a caterer or for the host to provide the liquor. That's what they're asking to do tonight. If you have any questions about that. The second part is they are now looking for that supplemental entertainment ability, so that ability to have live bands at their banquet hall event space. So how this would look is if the board doesn't have a problem with the Class Q license request, it'll go to village board for approval, and then there will be a second consideration for the supplemental entertainment. In the first year that a business wants a supplemental entertainment B license, it goes to the village board. It goes to the village board because being that this is the more intensive request, this isn't the simple radio play or you know, like I said, acoustic guitar. Since this is DJs and live bands, the consideration for the village board is proximity to homes, other businesses in the area. Will this cause an effect? The board then decides whether or not to approve it. After the first year it's approved, the liquor commissioner every year after has the ability to look at the history of the space, see if they've had any concerns, and they can reissue it without board approval in perpetuity. So with that, in this regard, if you, in your memo, you'll see that they are residing in a multi-use commercial strip center. Currently residing there is a beauty salon, fitness center, insurance office, restaurant. They anticipate their hours of operation to be 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. Sunday through Thursday. Events ending at 10 p.m. The premise is vacated by 11. And then 7 a.m. to 12 a.m. on Friday and Saturday, with events ending at 11:30, vacating premises by 12:30 a.m. The business is located approximately 520 feet from the nearest residence. So those are the things for consideration. If the board has no additional stipulations, it goes for regular approval. If you have additional stipulations, you can place them on the business for approval at the next meeting.
I guess I had one question. As far as like the other businesses in there, I'm not sure what's adjacent right to it, but like if you'd have something at 11 a.m. in the morning and you have State Farm next door and you got everything cranked up, how things going to affect the businesses? Because I think homes, you're far enough away, but how do we address that? Or because we kind of had a similar issue, another spot where the building wasn't soundproof too well.
Sure.
And it carried. And
I believe the owners of that establishment are here tonight. If they would like to come up and maybe answer questions specifically to have they talked to the owners of the building or any other businesses. But as a reminder, the board can put stipulations, and we have done that, where we've said restaurants may not be able to have a supplemental entertainment past a certain time, or in this case.
yeah, maybe they couldn't start.
Right, it would be the opposite,
Yeah.
exactly.
For a certain time.
Yeah, if you want to come up, state your name and address. And
Sure. Good evening. So thank you for the opportunity, and
Yeah.
thank you so much for speaking. My name is Tiffany Nesbitt, and super excited about Sage Event Space that is coming. This is my husband, Kendall. This is the entertainment guy. But our plan, to your concern, would be if there are stipulations that are needed to make sure that, you know, if we need to start to have music at a certain time or hour, we certainly can accommodate that. We anticipate, though, that the DJs and or live music would probably be on Friday or Saturday in the evening. There probably will be, you know, baby showers during the day, but we don't think we'll be cranked up to the point that it would, you know, impact or interrupt any other businesses that are adjacent to us.
what do you have right next to you on both sides, and what would be there?
So we are actually on the end cap. So to the left of us is nothing, but
Okay.
then there is the truck depot, I think it is, that they dispatch. I think it's semi trucks. That's to my knowledge what is there. And then there is a country financial, and then I think down further it's vacant, and then we have the gym.
Okay. So you're on the west end?
Correct.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
Mainly just the residences
Yeah.
and making sure that the base isn't too high to be shaking their windows on a Friday or Saturday night. I
Right.
don't know exactly who lives over there, but just want to be cognizant of them.
So I don't know if we can have some stipulation for all that, because we do have one place in town that we have issues, and it's the base is one of them, and it's kind of subjective, but you know, people get annoyed with some of it. So, and so I don't know if we can, what we can do, but just the music will be the issue. I mean, we're happy that you're there, but it's just trying to accommodate for everybody, even if it's the State Farm guy that's working late. I mean, it's just you know, how loud is loud? How, like I said, bass, and I'm sure it won't be like super, super loud, but just want to make sure we protect everybody there. So.
Well, I can actually add some context to that. I'm a band leader for one of the special events bands, and we are like top of the line in Chicagoland area. We're at hotels, venues, spaces all the time. So a matter of EQ and making sure things are balanced well is huge for us, so that we won't, you know, get into any issues. So we'll definitely make sure of that.
Right. Well, I totally respect that, but I like to have something in writing that
Absolutely.
we can go back to, because, like I said, this one we're dealing with, nobody thought it'd be a problem, and we go back and forth. The police are there, and it's very problematic. So I don't know if we can just have something in there that's, however we can word it, the state with the noise issue.
So right now, our municipal code, the noise ordinance is 10 p.m. on Friday and Saturday nights, and then it's 9 during the weekdays. We don't have, it's not a perfect science when it comes to noise. As
Right.
a lot of people, some person might think noise is a bother, where other people are like, well, that's not bad. So the police tend to get called out there, and they end up being put in a situation where they use discretion. And a lot of times the officers will simply say, either turn down the music, or this is excessive, this is loud, and then the officers have the right to issue a noise citation. We haven't had that, but for that one instance at the restaurant in town, where we've had that happen a few times. In that regard, I think the issue there is the music late. and that they reside, in their case, they reside extremely close to residential behind them, whereas this does have a buffer. So as far as stipulations the board wants to add or considerations, I think it's open to things that you might want to do to enforce that. Whether it's bringing it back to the board if you receive a certain number of complaints, something like that, you can do that, I would assume. Kevin?
Yeah. It isn't as close as the one that's problematic. It's you know, we have the time frames in there, obviously. The buildings may be different also in terms of you know, whether sound carries or not. We always have our noise ordinance that we can fall back on. It's kind of hard to craft. I mean, I can't think of a good way to craft language off the top of my head that would, you know, we put language into the ordinance, but then to craft language for particular circumstances, the one one that's problematic is they're really close, and it's also Silver Trails, which is all like over 55, so that kind of exasperates the problem also. How close, comparatively, would you say the residences are to this particular?
Well, they said 500 feet, right?
Yeah, this is 520 feet, give or take. Silver Trails, off the top of my head, I would not be shocked if it was 50 to 100 feet to the back of homes.
That seems 520 feet seems pretty far.
Yeah.
The other thing, too, is the owners have stipulated in their request that they do have anticipated end times. One of the things that did occur with that last establishment is they stated they anticipated to be closed at a certain time, but then immediately started staying open way later. And I think that created some of the issue because the board looked at it and probably said, oh, well, they'll be closed by 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. and all of a sudden they're open till
Well, that's the
midnight or
concern
1.
that, you know, they said this and then that was that. So that was my only concern about all, you know, everything. And like I said, maybe not the homes, it could be adjacent renters there as well. So, okay, well, guess we'll have to.
So if we approve it, can we not revisit it? Let's just say, like you had mentioned, if there were complaints or, you know, there were some issues with it, can we not go back and revisit it and change it somehow then? Or
So
is it just kind of, you know?
Having recently gone through several liquor hearings, it is a long due process to go back after the fact and then go through the process of determining whether or not someone violated a liquor license and whether or not you can add a fine and then there's rules basically on what's an acceptable fine, what's an acceptable revocation.
So it's cumbersome to go back once you've approved it. Okay.
It can be done, but it does take time.
I understand.
Can you shorten the renewal process?
Shorten the review process?
Yeah.
You can shorten, I think the way that we've looked at it is due process has to have a reasonable amount of notice. So I think the last one we did was a reasonable notice is we gave the business owner a week to meet with us. And that was, hey, this issue's been relevant. You know about the issue. You have a week to come in and actually meet with us at a hearing to discuss this issue.
But we can't approve it for, say, 3 months and revisit it in 3 months.
Yeah,
could be a stipulation.
One thing we could do, I suppose, is just, you know, have a periodic review, just, you know, especially maybe in the first year or something like that, that's part of the conditions, just to, you know, see how it's going, and with the potential, I guess, that, you know, at a certain, like after a year, that additional conditions could be imposed, perhaps. So if that were stated, and maybe we should do that for every entertainment license.
Right.
Yeah, I think the issue when you look at it, we haven't had a history of businesses with the supplemental entertainment license being an issue per se. Like we haven't gotten tons of complaints for establishments that do have bans and whatnot at times. That one particular, probably the residential proximity, was a major concern.
But they had different people operating the sound and, you know.
And also staying open later than I think the
they
board
said
anticipated.
they would, but they were, you know, they can stay open later, but.
So one of the things I would do is, in looking at what's in front of you, the owners here have already stipulated what time they anticipate closing. that would be something for consideration is, okay, if they expect all music to be shut down by a certain time, maybe that would be a good time to at least start and saying, okay, no music past this time.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, I think that'll work.
Yeah, and our village ordinance covers business, or I'm sorry, noise ordinance covers the businesses too, right? I mean,
Correct.
as long as, yeah, I mean, as long as that's in place,
Yeah, but
I
that
think we'll
doesn't
be all right.
always cover the removal of the license, you know, that's the thing, that it's, you know.
It's a little bit of a gray area
It's
there.
going to be there every week, and,
Yeah.
you know, but not saying, it's just something we had to experience, like
No, that's
our
fair.
attorney said, we might do that just on every business, just because it helps us a little bit, and we want to protect you guys as well as every other business and residents, so.
So a banquet, I would think, would be different than like a restaurant bar, like the one in question. I think banquets have, let's just say it's a wedding shower or some type of.
But if they have a wedding and the
Yeah.
reception's there, you know, which is
But-
good, because that's.
It's private, it's
Wow.
not a public event, right? It's just like,
Yeah,
it's
it's not
a
a
wedding,
public,
it's a
it's more of
shower, it's a
a-
party, whatever
Correct.
it may be, yeah.
In my opinion,
Yeah.
it's there's a little more control with the you know, they got to lease it, they got to, you know, the caterer.
Are you guys going to be doing the music then if they have a event there, or are they bringing outside music as
More
well?
than
or-
likely, we will.
You will, so
Uh-huh.
that's.
So
yeah.
So
I
we
think
will have
it's-
preferred vendors. So in the case of an individual saying, hey, I'm renting this space
Right.
and I'm bringing in my cousin,
Yeah.
our plan is not to do
Okay.
that. We will have preferred vendors that are professional, that we believe will follow the rules. We don't want to get in trouble. I'm sure that's probably what the other business owner said, but we really don't want to get in trouble.
So I think it's like maybe a different setting, in my opinion. than-
I think it's a little different.
All right, well. we'll
I like
keep
the
it as it
periodic
is, but-
review, I think that,
Yeah.
I think that works
We'll
well.
come as often as you need us to.
All right,
We're glad you're here.
Thank you.
So keep
we'll
it.
just keep it as it is.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else on that, on Steve?
Nope.
Anything
Nope,
else
we'll
for
just
item
bring it
2?
back to the board, both of those items then.
Yeah. All right, thank you. Next item would be item 3, utility tax.
So item number 3 tonight is a discussion of our utility tax. This is relevant to the potential new public works facility. So as the village board approved earlier tonight, a question for a referendum, when we were doing presentations about our public works facility, we had looked at multiple ways to fund a building, one of which a referendum would obviously be the easiest way to do it, because the amount of money expected to be generated by a referendum would be enough to pay what we expect to be the annual debt on that building. But in the case that the referendum does not pass, the funding sources that we had looked at included a combination of using funds, internal funds that we already have in place, and additional sources of revenue to meet that gap that's there. So with tonight, and just off the top of going back to that's relevant to the option where we looked at using our annual general fund transfer was one of the options. Every year we budget for a transfer from our general fund to our capital fund to pay for future projects in the capital fund. Essentially, the option that the staff had presented was using that transfer annually for the debt of the building, and additional revenue from a utility tax would get us pretty close if we were to raise our utility tax to actually get us close to what we expect the annual debt levy to be. So the discussion, the reason it's relevant tonight is we're looking at whether or not we should bring back an ordinance to increase our utility taxes, have it in place so that we know that when we go forward with the public works building, if the board is still going forward with that building, it allows us to actually bid that project out regardless of the referendum and get that bid process going in the spring and know that we have a dedicated funding source. The ordinance can simply say that should a referendum be approved, the utility tax raise does not go into effect. It just we make it so that it doesn't go into effect until, let's say, June 1, and then at that point, if the referendum is approved, it just goes null and void at that point. So it never goes into effect. So with that, Jason's going to walk us through the utility tax discussion.
Okay, so first tonight I'm just going to start with just a brief overview of utility tax. Our 3 utility taxes are electricity tax, natural gas tax, and telecommunications. The village last increased these in 2009. Their The electricity tax is charged on a kind of a 10-tier system by basically kilowatts hours used. We'll get into that in a little bit here, but most of those rates that the village had nearly doubled back in 2009. The natural gas tax went from 1.5 to 3%, and the telecommunications tax went from 2.5 to 4%. Those rates have then since basically been the same ever since 2009. And just a brief history, electricity and natural gas tax, those go into our capital projects fund. So those go to actually fund some of our capital projects along with the non-home rule sales tax. And the telecommunications tax goes into our general fund just to fund general operations. So starting with that electricity tax I'd mentioned, off to the right here, I just have a brief breakdown of the kind of current rates and the maximum that we can charge. I'm really going to focus more on that first line, that first 2,000 kilowatt hours, because going back and looking at my bills, my personal ones, majority, almost nearly every residential account here is going to be under 2,000 kilowatt hours. So that's where everyone's going to fall here. A lot of the business and industrials are going to fall in these upper tiers. So majority of what we're looking at is just going to be in that 2,000 kilowatt hours. Our current budget, we budgeted $382,500 is electricity tax revenue. So if we went and actually adopted the maximum rates allowed, we project that'd be another $300,000 annually coming in. And then on average, residents would probably see anywhere from $15 to $30 increase in their bills, just depending on how much energy you actually use on a monthly basis. And just a quick comparison, and again, I'm just really going to focus on that first column, that first 2,000 kilowatts. When you look at a lot of our comparables in town here, we're kind of towards the lowest. We basically have Geneva, who's coming in at the lowest, but everybody else is kind of coming in above us. Majority, you see Montgomery, Sugar Grove, and Yorkville are all at that 0.05 cents per kilowatt hour. We're at 0.0334. There's one exception with the City of Aurora. City of Aurora actually charges the maximum allowed that they can by state statute. So they've got their set at basically the highest level. Moving into the national gas tax. So this gets charged on everybody's bill on the gas costs and the delivery charges. Our current rate is 3%. The maximum we can do is 5%. Off to the right there, you see our 3%. Us and Oswego are basically at 3%. All of our other comparables who have that percentage base are at 5%. The exceptions there are Aurora and Batavia. They actually charge on therms used rather than a percentage of the cost. And I know on the Aurora side, that's definitely because of their home rule status. They can actually charge on how much you consume rather than a percentage. Our current budget is $225,000, and again, this varies year to year based on whatever energy costs are, how much you use if we have a bad winter. If we were to go from a 3% to a 5%, that'd be an extra $150,000 thereabouts on an annual basis, and again, that'd probably put another $15 to $30 on an annual basis on a average resident's bill. And then the final one is telecommunications tax. This rate gets charged on landline telephones, text and talk mobile, paging services, two-way radios. The one thing that it doesn't get charged on, though, is a lot of our cell phone packages. So if we have packages that just charge us like data only or like unlimited plans, the telecommunications tax doesn't get charged on that. And what you see a lot of statewide is just telecommunications tax in general. These past few years has just been going down, like all municipalities, because we're moving more and more to these packages where this tax isn't even applicable anymore. And you can see that too, just looking at the history of the village's telecommunication tax. It's just kind of slowly been going down over these last few years. Our current rate is 4%. The most we can do is 6%. Looking at some of our comparables, we're the lowest. We've got St. Charles and Yorkville coming in at 5%, and then basically everybody else is at the maximum 6%. We currently budget $126,000. If we were to do the maximum rate, we'd be $62,500, $63,000 in more revenue annually. But because how I mentioned that it's really kind of up in the air as to what gets charged, and some of us have things that probably don't even get charged this tax. We really can't determine how much it would cost the actual resident, because if somebody were only have a cell phone with a data package and that's the only thing they really have, they wouldn't be paying this tax. But if somebody had landlines and things like that, then they'd be getting charged with this tax. So all those three altogether, we would think that would bring in at about $512,000 on an annual basis. Residents would see anywhere from a $30 to $60 annual increase on their utility bills from raising these rates. As Steve mentioned, if this were a funding source that we'd want to look into, we could always pass an ordinance just saying this is effective June 1st, July 1st. In the event that the referendum didn't pass, if it failed, this would go into effect. But if the referendum passed, then we would just say this ordinance is rescinded, no longer apply, rates stay exactly the same they are. So, we're just looking for feedback as to, how to proceed with basically like a backup funding source for the building.
Well, I think that the sales referendum will pass, so I don't think there's a need to put on something else that we got to look at it. We're going to, the one we just approved tonight is going to pass, and we're going to approve that, and I don't even see why we have to put something else just because it doesn't pass. That's what I think. So I wouldn't be in favor of adding that in any way.
I agree with Mark. I mean, I think, we're in a really solid position right now. When you took a look at those projected numbers at where we're at, are you taking into account all the new development we have? We've got the new apartment complex. We still have some growth on the east side. The board, I didn't like it, but we just approved the property tax increase. I mean, I really think one of the big crises we're having right now is affordability, housing costs and affordability. And to say, on the one hand, we have a crisis, we don't have enough affordable housing, and then we're going to tax people for things they need to live in their house. I mean, that's just contributing to that issue. So and another issue that I have with this is I don't want to pass something that we can take it when we don't need it. So if we pass the referendum, if we say we're going to approve it now, it's very hard to take back what we already have granted power for. So I don't think that this is something we should be looking at.
The only reason that it was brought up at this time was because as we get near to the end of our design of our public works building, a lot of towns that are building big projects like that, what they'll do is they'll pre-bid out parts of the building that are millions of dollars worth because the lead time might be 6 months to a year to get those materials. And because those materials are significantly more expensive in inflation, the following year might be another 5% on those costs. So the idea was to have the discussion with the board so that there is a guaranteed funding source in place. So if the board, who will probably not see the final price of that building until May, June of next year, we already know that we have an estimated price of that building at around $17.6 million. What we will have by May, June, if the design keeps moving at this pace, is what they call a guaranteed maximum price. So that is the guaranteed price that when they bid it, it will not exceed that and the contractor will be able to do that work. If they want to bid anything before that GMP is created, you would have to know that the village is able to pay for that if the referendum fails. And so and honestly, nobody here wants to tax anybody more than we have to, which is why it would rescind automatically if the referendum did not pass. In that regard, we can simply wait, and we can wait to see how the referendum goes. It potentially could push the building back a few months in the process, but if that's what the board wants to do, we can do that.
Yeah, I think that'll work.
So I did want to be clear. You could approve it, and it would be rescinded if the sales tax referendum passed.
Correct.
Did I hear you?
It wouldn't go into effect. It just gets put on the books, but only to start on a certain day. And if the referendum passes, then it just rescinds on that day. It never starts.
Mm-hmm. And so if we don't approve it now, what is the lead time between the time that, let's say we did approve it, how soon can that tax be collected or enacted, I guess, however you want to say?
I'd first by saying this, if the board is comfortable with waiting for the referendum results, which is understandable, then the thing we would do is the first meeting after the referendum, should it not pass, is bring it back for discussion at that point. And I mean, we control our destiny when it comes to the building. The board can choose not to move forward with the building. You can choose to move forward. And at that time, if that works better for you and you want to reassess after the referendum, we can do that.
So we're not losing time by waiting, is all I'm asking, really. We're not.
You're potentially losing the ability to pre-bid some materials out, but quite frankly, because once again, you can always reject those bids too, though. And in theory, you can bid it out there and reject them if they come in. That's going to come up in the next couple months as we near the end of the project.
Let me ask you this. Can we, when you're doing the presentation for the sales increase, that I mean, somehow we gotta pay for what we're gonna be using, the building or whatever our construction or our capital expenditures are. So can't we just say, hey, wait, by the way, if this fails, there's gonna be a tax?
Yeah, I almost feel like if we pass this now, that's kind of what we're saying. Like,
Right.
you better
Right.
pass the sales, referendum, or else we're going to tax you. I don't think that's a good look, in my opinion.
Right.
I would
You don't think
rather
we're-
wait till right after.
I'm sorry, Todd,
We
could you say that
we have
again?
to be careful about what we say because we cannot promote the referendum. We can only provide information.
Right.
Sure.
I think we have put information out that explains the intention behind the
All right, okay.
referendum, which
So-
is to avoid taxing using other kinds of taxes. I think that's stated as a
So in the village information that we currently have our website up and running that has, right on our homepage, you can click on the sales tax referendum information, and it gives a pretty good summary of everything. And in there, it talks about potential future projects, including the Public Works building. But it does say that the village is looking at alternative, funding sources. It doesn't guarantee that the referendum is specifically tied to the Public Works building, because in essence, it's not. It's a mutually exclusive project. If it fails, the board can choose other revenue sources and still build that building or not move forward at all.
Todd, could you restate what you said? I didn't quite hear it, what you said.
What I say?
Yeah.
I think if we were to pass this now and say, we're not going to do this unless the referendum fails, I think that's kind of almost strong-arming voters and saying, you better do this or else we're going to tax you more. I just don't think that's a great look.
That's a good point.
And then when is the referendum? Is it February?
Early voting might start in February, but the actual vote is
March 19th.
March 19th.
March, okay.
19th. Yeah.
Jason? Any thoughts or agree with that? Yeah.
I'm okay.
Yeah.
One thing, I always did some rough calculation, and the increase to our citizens is about, 35 cents a day? And I thought that wouldn't be too bad of an impact, but Todd makes a good argument. I think that's pretty prudent to be careful about how we present it if we were going to do it at all.
Well, we can't present it in any way, actually, when it comes to the sales tax referendum, and that's what Kevin was saying. You can't really mention one with the other because it would appear exactly as Todd states.
But even
I personally would be in favor of approving it, and if the sales tax referendum doesn't pass, then the mechanism is already there. The bids are probably going to, I don't know, costs might go down, costs might go up, so you're taking a risk, not being able to pre-bid those things. I actually see it both ways. I'm comfortable with approving it and then having it just be implemented if the sales tax referendum doesn't pass.
And I would say that in all the conversations we had internally, the staff had the same concerns that were brought up. Nobody here wants to have the appearance that we're pushing one way or the other. It was simply mostly because of the timing of the fact that we have a construction management company that's telling us that if you bid this project out, and without a guaranteed funding source for that, what it does is it just pushes back the timeline for when we probably can start bidding out parts of the project, because it wouldn't be guaranteed that we're moving forward. But that's okay, because we'll wait for the referendum if that's what the board wants, and we'll just come back right away, and depending on those results.
I'm just kind of hanging my hat on what Kevin said, which is you can't present one with the other, so it wouldn't. I don't know that we would look like we're strong arming
I think
the
we're good.
residents about
I
it.
agreed with, I mentioned that to you early on when this was, I said, people are going to look at it as like, well, if you don't vote, then there comes a tax,
Yeah.
so we owe it to our residents probably just, I get the timeline and it could go up 5 to 7%, all the materials, but guess we'll hold off and go from there.
Cross that bridge when we get there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
All right.
we'll just come back
That's fine.
after the referendum,
Yeah,
and we'll
like I
revisit
said,
it if we need to.
I kind of see it both ways, to tell you the truth.
All right. Thank you. All right. Next item, item 4, Steve.
Mr. Mayor, once again,
Oh,
given my involvement, I'd like to recuse myself.
All right. We'll come get you. All right. Item 4, Steve.
Okay, our final item on the agenda tonight is a discussion about Oak Hill's HOA and their current status and what it means relative to the land in the common area that they currently own. So basically, as we discussed earlier tonight, we got word that the HOA for Oak Hill subdivision is looking to dissolve. The reason it came up tonight as the levy was the letter that we received from the property management company said that they expected to dissolve within 30 to 60 days. I'm not sure that timeline is still relevant. It might be a little longer out if they do choose to dissolve. But what I wanted to first do is separate all the issues because they tend to get convoluted when you're having a conversation because there's multiple things moving here. So there are three things to consider with the possible dissolution of the Oak Hill HOA. The first is who maintains the common area and how is it paid for. And that first item was already addressed tonight. We have an SSA, a special service area, that can collect money from the taxpayers of that subdivision and use it for the maintenance of their common areas, their pond, the creek, I believe their entryway sign, and that's the point of having a backup SSA. We've actually had that SSA levied at $10,000 for the last few years, collecting money for a future pond improvement, and we've even used some of that money when they had some of the creek dredged to allow that pond to flow into the town center wetlands. So that's the first issue, and that's already been established. If they dissolve, there is an SSA that is adequately being accounted for next year's maintenance. And as I think Jason said earlier, our intent is to contact that property management company and let them know right away that the board approved that SSA additional funding tonight for the common areas so they don't essentially double tax the residents there. The second thing is there have been concerns about their pond. The pond, for years there's been concerns about the pond, and they have gone into a discussion where we've levied that $10,000, had some dredging done, but there, at that time that work was done, there was also a assessment of erosion and whatnot around the pond. There was concerns that there will be a much larger project needed in the future. That is on its own separate path. Right now, the staff, village engineer, our assistant public works director, is working with an engineering firm. The first thing we're doing as part of that SSA that we already have is looking to have an engineering assessment of the pond, determine exactly what the baseline is for where it should be as far as, you know, the land and the water levels, whatnot. And then with that assessment, go out to whether it's RFPs or bid to get proposals from companies. And it most likely be an RFP because that leaves it open for companies to provide their interpretation of ways to fix the pond as opposed to us telling them what it is. And what that whole process, by the time you get the engineering done and you go out to RFP and you start reviewing those proposals, that probably won't be until summer of next year. And at that time, the board can look at the cost, and if it is an expensive, as we expect it would probably be, if there's any expensive work that should be done, then the board would take that into consideration next fall when the levy is being set for the SSA again. So to put that, there's $25,000 being levied right now for that SSA for next year. If the pond was super expensive and we had to levy more per year to pay that back, we could, but we wouldn't even be there until this time next year finalizing the levies, you know, November, December. So those are two separate issues. We have the SSA already in place. It's already being levied appropriately for their common areas. The pond is a separate issue that is already being looked at separately under that SSA. The third issue, and the issue that's relevant specifically to tonight, is the ownership of the properties. As of right now, just like in any subdivision, when there is an HOA, the HOA is owner of said common area. These would be like, medians, or in the case of Oak Hill, they have a lot that's an empty lot that I think was for potential consideration for a park when established 30 years ago, and it just sits there as an empty piece of grass, but it has to get mowed and maintained properly, and they have a creek that runs through their subdivision into the pond and then out of the pond into the town center wetlands. All of that is relevant to land that they own. So what they're asking for now is, how does that work? Would the village be interested in actually taking ownership of the land? And the reason that's relevant is if the HOA deeds the land to the village would then have ownership of the property, have the right to act as if it's our own property, do the things that we would normally do without having to worry about who has ownership, signage, any work that has to be done, we would have the right to just go ahead and do that work as necessary. The HOA would be losing the ability to enforce their bylaws. If ownership transfers to the village, everything reverts back to the municipal code. So basically, property maintenance code that we enforce would now be, quote unquote, the bylaws of that subdivision. So with that, there is right now, as we are aware right now, there's not an active HOA board. What we have been told legally is that you have to have an HOA board active in order to officially deed the property to the village. Why this conversation is happening specifically tonight is before an HOA officially dissolves, they're still technically an active entity, which means they can have an election, reinstate a board, and that board can reassemble for the sheer ability to dissolve and transfer that property to the village. They would want to know if that's something that they should be doing, and they would have to know if the village is willing to actually accept that land before going through that process. So as I said before, tonight's conversation is relative to feedback on whether the village would take ownership of the common area and pond or let it remain in the HOA's hands, and if they dissolve, it essentially, that land is being maintained by the village, but it's owned by a defunct entity. And Kevin has written a memo on that, and he is going to walk through what that means.
Can I ask one real quick question, though?
Sure.
What would be any advantage for not owning it?
So where Kevin's conversation tonight as our attorney, I think he would talk about liability of owning it versus not owning it, and what liabilities we have either way. But as I said earlier, for the residents, the advantage of, let's say, the village having it is then there's a guaranteed maintenance of that property moving forward. If they don't have a board representing them, the village would maintain that property. They would still be paying for that maintenance through the SSA, but they would have someone where they know the village is doing it. Another advantage would also be that the village has the ability to do anything on that property without having to try to go through a defunct entity or try to determine what rights we have and our limitations of the SSA, meaning if we want to do something, but it's outside of the scope of the SSA, we may be limited to the types of things we can do on those properties. The advantage to the residents to maintain an HOA would be the bylaws, the ability to enforce additional property maintenance codes above and beyond what the village's municipal code sets. So really, that's kind of the crux of it. If Kevin would like to go over.
I have a question, though. If we take ownership of it, we take it off the tax roll, right?
It's not, it's taxed as common area right now, so.
Right, but we still get some income. We get property
Yeah,
taxes.
there's no tax.
So
They don't tax common area.
They don't pay property taxes for land that they own?
No, it's a not-for-profit. HOA is a not-for-profit.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's already tax exempt. The big issue, well, there's two, but the big one is risk, liability. And there is, there's always risk in taking any action. So maintaining the common areas is, there's risk that is associated with that. If we do, if we don't do a good job, if we create a dangerous situation, there's risk. The risk is greater if we own it. If we don't own it, we have our scope of risk is less. I can't really quantify that for you. There's no way I can really tell you that the risk is 10% more or 50% more or 60% more. I can't really do that. So all I can say is that the risk is greater if you own it because there's nobody else. You're it. But there is some risk simply to maintain it. So I think that's one issue. The other is, and it's kind of this is a bigger policy issue, kind of almost a village-wide issue perhaps. And part of the memo that I did goes into the history of how we ended up where we ended up. in the beginning when some developments came in the 80s, Park District agreed to take property, like at Willow Lake. And then the Park District decided, no, we don't want to do that. We've taken enough property. And the village did take some property soon after that. For instance, Waterford Oaks. The village owns the detention in Waterford Oaks. But kind of quickly transitioned to this, what we do now, which is we require the setup of an HOA, and the village sets up a backup special service area, and we've been operating that way, since the early 90s. So, here we are now. We're kind of getting to the point where we've had some HOAs fail, like Tanner Trails. The North Aurora Town Center property, Rubloff, is kind of defunct and not in the picture anymore. So we've had a couple of situations like that, and now we've got Oak Hill, and there may be others in the future. So I think, it's kind of the larger context. Is this something that we are willing to entertain on a kind of a global village-wide basis, that if HOAs don't want to manage common areas anymore, are we going to decide that we'll step in and take them over, or not? Now, there is some mitigation in the sense that this is a little bit unusual because there's a creek that, there's a watershed that runs through Oak Hill. There's a creek that comes across Randall Road from up north, runs through Oak Hill to the pond, and then out into the North Aurora Town Center wetlands. So it's a little different, really, than a lot of the developments that we have. Most developments don't have that kind of a creek that drains a watershed. So in terms of precedent, this really could be a one-off. It could be that, okay, we'll take this, but we aren't going to be in the business of taking over common areas. That, those are the issues, I think. I think that those are, deciding this, you're kind of deciding it in the context, village-wide, and considering what impact it has. But I think there is a way to say, okay, we're going to take this one if you want to. That doesn't mean that this is precedent going forward. We can kick that can down the road. We can make a policy decision later, or take them as they come, perhaps.
I have a question. Under the circumstances, if we don't take ownership and the HOA disbands, who owns it?
So that's a good question, and I do not have a good answer.
I don't like that idea. I can tell you that. And then,
well, the owner is the disbanded entity, right? They're the legal owner, even though they're a disbanded entity.
Yeah,
they are the legal owner.
I don't know. I went to Chicago Title, and of course they would say, well, we'll tell you what we need to insure it.
Well, right. It's a different question.
Which doesn't, and that's kind of, I knew I was going to get that kind of an answer, but I wanted to just throw it out there and see what, their legal counsel would say. So, and this is a relatively, frankly, it's a somewhat relatively new thing that there are HOAs typically in new developments. That's happened in my career. When I first started, that was kind of when HOAs really started to come into their own. Every development had an HOA. Before that, it wasn't quite that way. I mean, there were covenants. Sometimes there were HOAs, but they weren't as common as they are now. So I have a feeling that this, we're not the only municipality that's probably wrestling with this issue right now, but it's also kind of a little bit of a limbo, and there's not case law out there to go look
I mean,
at.
if you don't have an HOA, right, who's paying for the liability insurance for, like, if someone something happens on that empty lot or wherever the common space is, what recourse does the resident have if you have a disbanded entity who is, let's say, arguably the legal owner of that property? So where does that leave the residents without a homeowners association? But then again, if we take it from them, then that becomes our liability. So I think it's a difficult question.
And I don't know if it changes how we look at development going forward. Maybe it does. Maybe there's a different way to approach it. Typically when we annex property, that annexation agreement's in place for 20 years. We have kind of some enforcement control that way, but then the annexation agreement, sunsets after 20 years, and we no longer have, that kind of a control. It gets us 20 years out, and maybe that's okay. I don't know. It's kind of a new world. Yeah, the village does have tort immunity, so that provides some measure of protection. It's not, that tort immunity. There's different kinds of immunity for different kinds of things, and it's not foolproof. I mean, if there's an open and obvious danger, we're not, and if we don't do anything about it, there's no immunity for that.
You know about it first.
We do. It has to be something that's kind of open and obvious.
I got a question for Steve. Is this the area that they had the renter or the party people, and they're in that house, and they're having problems with the neighbors?
About Airbnbs?
Yeah.
Correct.
Now, if we take ownership of that HOA, does that help us with remedying that situation?
Yeah, no, if we take the common area, we control the common area. We don't control anything in the subdivision at all, other than through our codes.
We don't take over the association.
I
in
know,
other
but they
words.
did have something they had in talking with Todd, that they had something in their HOA that they thought would limit the
But we're
bed and breakfast.
protected from that. I know that's very specific, but we're protected from it because we passed a rule that doesn't allow it in certain zoning districts. So essentially, no one else can open an Airbnb right now in North Aurora because of our codes.
Yeah.
Which would
So that would help
supersede-
us.
Yeah. So, well, no, right now it's already in place. So regardless
All
of
their
this.
HOA rules drop, so like if they didn't allow chain link fences, whatever the village allows now is going to be acceptable.
Right.
That's correct.
It defaults
They're
to
subject
our
to the village
code
ordinances
if
as
there's
opposed to
no
the HOA
HOA.
ordinances.
So let me get it right. So they want to dissolve. If we don't take ownership of the property, it goes into no man's land, and then there's like litigation, and then the property goes to whoever wants to do the repairs.
There's probably no litigation. I mean, there's nobody that
So it
wants
just
it.
sits there? I mean, what do we do?
Yes.
What do you-
It is a question, and we looked at, so like if we decided down the road that we wanted to take ownership, a common way to do that would be through a quiet title action, but you have to have some claim of an interest in the property, and simply an SSA with the authority to manage it doesn't give us the kind of claim that would allow us to take title through a quiet title action. Now, we could acquire it through open and obvious use. I'm drawing a blank on what the terminology is. It's an easement that you acquire by adverse possession. So if we take care of it for 20 years, it's open and obvious, and it's against all other claimants. We would probably have a right to quiet title action to claim title if we decided down the road. Like if we decided now we don't want to take it, and in somewhere down the road we say, you know what, it would be better if we had it. In 20 years, we could probably do that through a quiet title action because of adverse possession.
To me, this seems a different, like you mentioned, the watershed. I mean, they're taking water from behind Walgreens up major part of the village, or a good portion of it, and it's a little different than one retention pond and one subdivision that just gets the runoff and things in there. So maybe we could, I'm not opposed of taking it, and I think, like you mentioned, we have control of the work there. So I mean, there's nobody else we have to talk to when this has to be done or that has to be done. And like I said, that creek that runs north services, where you live, Mark and Jason, and other places. So it's kind of like, they're doing a service.
Is the HOA definitely dissolving, or if the village doesn't want to take over it?
Well, currently, we don't believe they have an active HOA board.
Oh, okay.
And so for that reason, they haven't been able to establish a board for some time, so they would be looking to dissolve because
So
there's no
they're not
active-
officially disbanded, but based on the circumstances, they're looking to do that.
Correct.
Okay.
And for the historical perspective from the village, the village, as Kevin wrote in his memo, we have several properties right now that have been deeded to us for some time that are covered by SSAs. The piece of woods between Sharon and Oberweis is in our name. Timber Oaks is detention area, Waterford Oaks. These are areas where HOAs never established and whatnot, and they were deeded over to the village. The one thing it does, like I said earlier, is the real issue is that the village, when you have control, you have the ability, like you said, if we want to do a big project, but it's just outside that scope of what the SSA limits those funds for, we might have a little more opportunity. And then but on the downside, once you lose an HOA, it is hard to reestablish an HOA. And
You'd have to have 100% of the property owners to
the
reestablish.
question, this is the way I think, because this is a very complicated issue, but the easiest way to surmise it is, in my conversations with Kevin, was if there's an operational benefit for the village to have it, the question becomes is how much quantifiably is that liability from being the one maintaining it but not officially owning it, or officially owning it and maintaining it? And is there an actual quantifiable difference? And without that answer, I don't know.
I'm inclined to kind of think that maybe we should consider or take a look at ownership in this one instance and make sure they make it clear that that's not a precedent-setting decision that we made. And the reason for that, the reason my thinking goes, is that since it's a unique situation with the watershed issue, that maybe we should take control. It's only one more piece of property added to what, 3 or 4 that we own now. And so I don't think that would be that much of a long-term impact on the village.
And if the board wanted to do that, my suggestion, and I'd run it past Kevin, but my suggestion would be treat this in a way like a variance in a way. So every time like a variance would come before the board, which we don't get many, but let's say one did, each one is kind of created as a individual basis. You're looking at that, but you're also looking at past precedents and why something was approved. Like, I allowed this person's garage, so do I have to allow this next person's garage? Oh, but this one was located next to an industrial area and this one was next to residential. So each one is unique in its own way. But when you approve it, you can put the stipulations for why you approved it that way in the approval. So my suggestion would be is if the board chose to take the deeded property, you stay for the purposes of, you know, this being a watershed or whatever, and you can actually, so that the staff, I always tell them the memos, the most important thing about us writing the memos is making sure the public gets good information, the board gets good information, and the staff goes back to those memos and we remember exactly why we did things. And so that's what I would do, is you would approve it with those stipulations in there, like, that's why we did that.
I agree. I think that, so my concern is protecting the property values of the people that live in the development. And if you've got this no man's land, nobody wants to deal with it, that could potentially be an adverse situation within the neighborhood. So just for clarification, if we took ownership of it, we could maintain an SSA on the property to pay for maintenance to it?
Yes, because right now we levy an SSA on Waterford and Timber Oaks, and those properties are in our
So
name.
if we can do that, take possession of it, that way protecting the property values of the residents, we've got control of it, we can charge them for the maintenance to it, and then insert the language that these were the specific reasons in this instance why we are doing it. Because I think that's one of our biggest roles as the board, is to protect property values and make the village a nice place to live. And when these HOAs are now at risk of failing, that may be one of the biggest risks we have to our properties. So I have no problem taking ownership of it, but we do need to be specific with it, and we do need to make sure that, you know, we're not absorbing the cost.
I would say I agree with that approach.
Yeah, any costs incurred would be passed along in the SSA, so it's kind of a no-brainer, I think.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm in favor of it all the way.
Any other questions, Steve?
No, I think that's good. We'll bring it back on, well, we'll bring it back when we hear from the property management company and see what the status is.
One more final thing, not to prolong the meeting, but are HOAs kind of generally folding, or is that this is a unique situation with the HOA, in fact?
I would say this, sorry, Trustee Lowry.
Pardon me?
I would say this, didn't mean to interrupt you, but in my 10 years here at the village, I don't recall an HOA folding in that time. We had another HOA reach out to me about 5-6 years ago when they were considering dissolving, and we met at the police department and we talked about it. And I remember the issue was they were under the impression that by dissolving, there was a piece of property in common area they didn't want to maintain anymore. And they're like, well, the village will just take it. And I said, no, there's an SSA. If we take it, we are going to levy money for that SSA to maintain it. And I think that changed their mind right away, because they're like, oh, we just thought we would give you the land and then you would maintain it. And I'm like, that's why we have SSAs, for that reason.
Well, we have that, I understand from reviewing the material, that we have that policy that going forward, that we will not be doing this. We'll be encouraging or demanding that builders develop an HOA within any given construction
The
area.
real issue that we have had, and it's prior to my tenure here, it really came from the commercial properties that were supposed to have HOAs. A lot of the issues we have are there are several areas in town that were supposed to have commercial HOAs established and they never did. And so one of the examples of that is the town center wetlands. It's in the name of an entity that I think technically is active, but we haven't had contact with in a long time. We've been levying money on that and maintaining those wetlands for years. It's hard to figure out who to contact when you need to do something. And it really does create an issue. And that is so all those town center issues that come up, if you remember, it's $25,000 this year for wetland maintenance. And we do all that because there isn't a commercial entity to actually do that. And the other instance, sorry not to prolong it, but since you asked, would be if you go to the area where the turf room is. That area was supposed to have a business HOA established. I believe they did originally, and they dissolved years ago. But if you remember, they were supposed to pave those private roads, and they didn't. And that was part of the stipulation of their approvals. And the village went back, and we went to every single property owner. And at the time, it was like 13 or 17 property owners. And we said, listen, you have an obligation. And the village did the work, and we proportionally divvied up the money. It was like $80,000. And we said, you owe $12,000, you owe $4,000. And each one of them paid it, one by one.
In that case, we were enforcing the annexation agreement that was still in place.
Right, because they didn't have their HOA was supposed to oversee maintenance of that road.
The main issue with this HOA is they don't really have a lot of bylaws that other HOAs have. So it kind of coincides with what the village already enforces. So there hasn't been a lot of activity with a board because there wasn't really a whole lot for them to do.
Yeah, the more I listen, the more I'm convinced that I think we should just take this ownership.
Best interest of the village.
Yep. So just to recap, so you're going to bring it back with the info as far as the watershed, and it's kind of a one-of-a-kind type.
Correct. And
thing,
the only timing, I can't give you the actual timing of this yet, is because now we'd have to go back and update the property management company, and they would have to, whatever their attorney that they use, they would have to determine a way.
No, I understand that.
Okay.
Right. I'm just saying that what the board wanted to add
Correct.
to
We'll
it.
come back with those stipulations as part of the approval.
Right. Okay. Anything else?
No, we're.
All right. Yep. All right, so that concludes our discussion items. Now we're going to motion to adjourn to go in exec session for property acquisition.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, the same sign. All right, thank you for coming, everyone.